Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Hey.
Welcome, welcome.
Friends.
So, before we get started with anything, I want to say happy belated birthday to both of you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So how did you guys celebrate?
I went to a wellness resort in Arizona.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
it was a
treating
good
yourself
time.
well. Very nice.
Yeah, trying to start off the new year in the right foot. It was
Mm.
good.
Oh. What
um,
about you, Dad?
I I feel like I'm somewhat still celebrating because my daughter just said, "Happy birthday, Bo. What are we doing today?" She doesn't want it to end. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like even when we're blowing out candles for my birthday, she was doing most of the blowing the candles, and I wasn't really doing much. So there's a lot more about her than me, which has been great, honestly. I mean, I feel like spending time with my daughter this weekend has been the highlight of my weekend. So I mean, that's really what I've been doing the whole time. Yeah, because I can't think of anything that I did yesterday. I went go karting, so that's like the one thing that I did for myself that was fun for my birthday. So
Oh,
yeah,
Cool.
gosh, I can't remember the last time I went go-karting. That's really cool. Very cool, though. Oh, happy to
yeah,
hear
you
that. You
should do it.
guys.
It's an adrenaline rush. I feel like it's a good adrenaline rush that you get when you get into 45-mile-per-hour cart going down a racetrack. So
Woo! Well, both of y'all sound like you started the new year off just right, so I'm happy to hear that, and cheers to many more, right?
yeah,
But
Thank you.
absolutely. Thank you.
but as we have people trickling in, I suppose we can go ahead and get started. I want to say hello to all of our viewers who are kind of tuning in to everything that we're doing. Of course, as you all know, I am the executive director and the founder of the Foundation for Interethnic Restoration. And today we have two guest speakers. We have Hoang Pham and we have Taifha Alexander. And I will actually hand the floor over to you guys to introduce yourselves, since you have such an extensive and impressive background. I guess Taifha, ladies first.
Sure. Absolutely. I am Taifha Alexander. I am currently the inaugural CRT Forward Project Director at UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies program. I earned my law degree, my first law degree from Georgetown, and my advanced law degree from UCLA. I was born and raised in Queens, New York, and I now call Los Angeles home. Outside of that, I like to go hiking and arrange flower arrangements and yeah, just really enjoy spending time outdoors and working with my hands. And especially like that, I think technically I'm still a newlywed, right? I've been married for 4 years now,
Mm.
going on 5 years in
Hey,
September. And
Hey.
yeah, he's my favorite person. So shout out to my husband, James.
Aww.
that's awesome. I was we just celebrated. My wife and I just celebrated our 5-year wedding anniversary, and
Congratulations.
thank you. It just seems like it went by
Congrats.
super quick, right? Like, are we
Yeah.
still newlyweds?
Yeah.
I have no, I don't know, but it feels that because then you meet people who are like, 50 years in the game, and you're like, yeah,
Yeah.
I
that's
see.
what you
Right,
get to.
right.
Yeah.
So,
It's still weird when people ask me for marriage advice. I'm like, um, I don't know. I'll give you something, but I don't know.
yeah.
So
I feel you. So let me do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Hoang Pham. I am a policy advisor and program manager at the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. I graduated from law school from UC Davis and joined the center shortly thereafter. Before I went to law school, I was a teacher for 6 years in South LA, and did some education consulting with the Center for Culture Responsive Teaching and Learning while I was both as a teacher and also when I was in law school. So just done a variety of different things. The work I do at the center right now is kind of a mixed bag of public safety, policing, and education work. And we're also very new. We've been around since June 2020, and I think one of the things that we've continually tried to think through is how do we, as a new center, really think strategically about how we address racial inequity within the United States. So exciting time as we grow as a center, but also like, things like this. I mean, Taifha, you may agree, but I feel like, it's something that is unconventional, right? It's not like what you would expect a law school center to get engaged in an Instagram live conversation about. Right. It's usually like a Zoom webinar, right? You'll have a typical registration portal that you go through, and you get a Zoom link, and you pop on. So it's I think these are the type of things that when we think about engagement, when we think about how do we democratize knowledge around particular issues, this format I think is very unique, and I'm just really grateful to be here and be in conversation with both of you.
Right. Right. And again, it's such an honor to have both of you here being able to participate and share your insight on the subject, especially as it relates to critical race theory and the education system, because like you said, these kinds of conversations are oftentimes relegated to like academic spaces or like very specialized spaces. People don't really dive into it until maybe they hear that it impacts their children. Maybe they take an interest, maybe they don't. But all in all, like this is an opportunity to bring this to the forefront for our community. So I really, really, really appreciate you guys taking the time to join us. So that having been said, I was, as people are continuing to pour in immediately, like how would one of you care to describe to me what critical race theory is? So this is what our subject is talking about, critical race theory, evaluating education, diversity, how that relates to history. I went and did my research and I see how critical race theory is defined. I'd be curious to hear you guys' definition or perspective.
Do you want to go first?
I want you to go. You should go first. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So critical race theory, oftentimes referred to as CRT for short, is both a practice and a theory that helps us understand how race and racism shape laws, policies, structures, despite civil rights advancements, right? And is committed to changing the laws that have produced and reified racial inequity over time, right? And so that's in a nutshell what critical race theory is, right? It's both an academic pursuit, something that you study, but it's also a way of moving in the world that allows for the dismantling of systemic injustices. And while the theory started in legal scholarship, it has since pervaded other areas and allowed for the study of how systemic inequities are able to be embedded in these different structures and practices and procedures. And so knowing that critical race theorists advocate for changes in addition to studying for these things. So that's why it's both a theory and a practice. And I think oftentimes in definitions, that's the thing that's sometimes left out. And I just wanted to lift it up here. But I'm interested in hearing what my colleague has to say.
You know what's funny is I'm looking at like my notes and I'm like, that's exactly what I was gonna say. But this is what I really appreciate about this space is though, is we do have a common definition for what it is. And for folks who are deeply, steeped in this particular way of thinking about the world, we know what we know how to define it in a way where it makes sense. But when you think about how when it gets into like a space where people haven't thought about it at all, but understand how to say critical race theory just as the term itself, I think that's where the misconceptions around what it is, really have take on the life that it does, right? Where there's a ton of misinformation about exactly what it is, what it does, like what students might be learning, what people are trying, like what the agenda behind it might be. But I think in the way that Taifha explained it, I mean, at its core, it's really a way, like an analytical framework of understanding and disrupting the centrality of race and racism, in American society. And, so one thing I wanted to add on to what Taifha already said is, if we kind of think about an easy way to kind of process why this thing came up, you can look at how post-civil rights, right? So the post-civil rights movement, all of these different legislative efforts were, successful at the federal level, but also at the state level. And yet we still had a persistence of racial inequity. And so scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, right, these kind of pillars in critical race theory, really were trying to understand, well, why, after the Voting Rights of 1965, like voter, disenfranchisement was still happening, right? Or Brown v. Board of Education, I think, might be like the seminal case. We're trying to think about education. Brown essentially was the case that struck down the legal racial segregation of students in our schools. And yet today, some of our schools are more segregated than they ever were before.
Mm-hmm.
And so critical race theory really is a tool that helps us understand, why is that the case? Like, why is this the outcome after all of these things that, all these advances with racial equity within our nation has happened, that we still have these persistent racial inequities that we experience within our country. So that's how, I would kind of conceptualize, in addition to what Taifha had already mentioned about what critical race theory actually is.
Thank you. And for those who are watching, I suppose, as you hear all of these new phrases, or you're introduced to this concept, understand that this is important, because when we talk about future generations having a better environment, a better societal environment, when you have a system that is preventing students from even learning about history from a fully rounded perspective, that influences generations of Americans, right? And so that makes it even harder to really facilitate any kind of change, or to really introduce any meaningful sense of equity and diversity, or anything along that line. Because what we've seen, for the most part, aside from the occasional endeavor, when something major happens, there's a big outcry, people will say, okay, we need to change something. But then when you follow up, nothing is done. Critical race theory is a very good step in the direction of actually integrating some kind of change that will have a legacy in America, right? That's how I also view critical race theory's importance across the education system. If we don't understand our history, then we are bound to repeat it, right? And understanding that it's not just about the history, it's also about the practice. So here's another question that I have for you guys. Because as you dig into critical race theory and you engage in conversations with different people, you hear a few accusations about what critical race theory is. So you just told us what it is. Can you tell us what it's not? Now, Taifha, you touched on the idea that it's not just a theory, but it's also a practice. I've heard people say that it's divisive, or that it's Marxist, or that it incites guilt. Can you guys weigh in on that?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, you should go first.
Okay, cool.
I feel like this will be the rotation.
Okay, this is the rotation. All right. So I think in order to lay the groundwork, essentially, we have to analyze what happened, right? So in the summer of 2020, right, we were engrossed in the largest civil and racial justice movement of our lifetimes, right? And this is when people are demanding that change be made. People are demanding that, systemic injustices are rooted out from all institutions in the United States and across the globe, right? And so that kind of challenge, right, that kind of shift in our current society is frightening to people who have always been able to accumulate power in ways that historically subordinated people have not, right? And so almost immediately after the ability to reach our full potential as a truly multiracial democracy, right, where there were bills that were being introduced in order to prevent lynching, there were businesses that were finally thinking about reparations after centuries-long wrongs that they have committed against communities of color. There were teachers who were really being intentional about how history was taught and the way in which it was taught, right? So almost immediately after we were able to see the fruits of that labor, there was this backlash. And there was a well-orchestrated extremely funded campaign to turn critical race theory essentially into a boogeyman, to make the theory seem divisive in order to accumulate and cement political power among a particular subset of a political party, right? And so what happened was a co-optation of the term critical race theory and a redefinition of it that was able to be extremely pervasive because of how well organized and how well funded this anti-CRT disinformation campaign was. Not only do you have elected officials or people who are I forget the particular person's position, but people who are involved in different anti-CRT, like the Heritage Foundation, these sorts of folks, different fellows at that institution who are committed to ensuring that this shift that the entire country, the entire world was demanding is not seen, right? So then critical race theory is misdefined, as we said once before, and then weaponized in a way that polarizes people who might have generally been supportive of critical race theory and its core tenets. And so critical race theory, what's interesting is one of my colleagues, also a fellow CRS alum, wrote a paper, Jonathan Feingold wrote a paper about how a lot of these bills that have been introduced, a lot of these anti-CRT bills, essentially say the same things that CRT says, right? CRT doesn't believe that there is a such thing as a superior race, right? A lot of these bans say the same thing, right? A lot of these bills are saying that people shouldn't be ashamed of who they are or feel guilty or feel any sort of psychological distress. CRT says that too, right? And so it's important to be able to understand what the theory says, and this definition that we have as a collective is helpful for that, but it's also important to understand what CRT isn't. And CRT isn't this Marxist doctrine or this doctrine that is trying to make certain people feel guilty for the lived experience of others, but it really is a critical analysis of really understanding where we are as a country and trying to figure out, is where we are, although it's better, is it the best that we can actually be? And so I've been talking too much, so I will pass it off and let someone else weigh in.
No, I just want to, I mean, it was, what you said was directly on point, and I feel like you should have kept going. Well, I think the first thing I'll say is CRT is not the boogeyman, right? Like it's not this thing that we need to be afraid of. It's not this thing that we need to spend all this effort legislating against, right? And to Taifha's point, I do think there was a coordinated strategy that happened at a really good time around, you know, what do we do to gain political power as a party in the United States that essentially was on the wave of losing a lot of political power, right? And so a lot of what was happening was this strategy that was happening behind doors around like, okay, how do we actually come up with something that will allow us to do that? And there was an individual, I don't even know if I want to really say his name.
I know, like he's like Voldemort, right?
Yeah, it's like, because it's like I don't want to like elevate him like that. But
yeah,
there was an individual who essentially came up with this idea, threw it in the former president's ear, and then it became like as the first thing that the president said at a speech in like September 2020 was like, we need to figure out what we need to do about critical race theory. And then that and Taifha, I know your work has actually looked at how much critical race theory as a term has been incorporated into media conversations. Like there's like a percentage of like how much it like exponentially increased over the course of like a year's time, right? Like you look at June 2019 and how much like CNN talked about critical race theory to like June of 2021, it was an incredible exponential increase. And so I think it was strategic. right? And critical race theory as a term in itself, I think, made it almost easily susceptible to that strategy, because you have three words that are all very controversial, right? Critical, race, and theory. All three things that if you kind of combine together, people can start thinking about, oh, well, this is like some, you know, abstract thing that no one understands, and it's created in academia. But and because of that, then we can decide to define it however we want to, and they did, right? And so but I'll start by saying, not the boogeyman, right? We shouldn't think of it as that, and it's also not anti-American. If anything, it is pro like democracy, pro who we are as individuals in the United States, because it is challenging us to think about how we improve our country for everyone who lives here. And just like Taifha said, I think that is a basis for why we need to understand the importance of critical race theory within our nation's context, because without it, we won't understand why our schools are more segregated than ever, right? We won't understand why inequities continue to persist in almost every part of our society, right? Healthcare inequities continue to persist. The environmental issues that we face are all disproportionately impacted. You know, people who are most impacted by these issues are people of color, primarily Black people in low-income communities, and Indigenous people in various different communities. And so, you know, it's not anti-American in the sense that if you actually understand the core tenets of it and why it's applicable to how we experience life today, we can actually improve our society for everyone who lives in the United States. I will stop there. Well, actually, last thing I'm going to say is the indoctrination piece, right? Because you hear this a lot. You hear a lot about how, you know, critical race theory seeks to indoctrinate our children as just a term, like a sentence. That's what you'll hear. It seeks to indoctrinate our children. There are signs that will say that at like rallies and protests. But the fascinating thing about the word indoctrination is that indoctrination actually is the subjection of individuals to some theory or concept or teaching without having them critically examine whatever you're teaching them, right? That's like the opposite.
The opposite, literally.
I mean,
the opposite.
First word in critical race theory is critical. So how do you indoctrinate, you know, how would you indoctrinate someone with critical race theory when the definition of indoctrination is at an opposite, you know, ideal to what critical race theory actually is? And if you go into any classroom, K-12, where teachers are actually teaching students about race and justice, you will actually experience that is not the case. They are not indoctrinating their children. In fact, what they're asking their children to do is to ask questions about the world around them. Because our kids already know. If anybody's ever taught students in K-12 schools, they already understand injustice at a very deep level. And so you don't have to like teach them that this is happening to them or their community. They can tell you that. And so I think like the whole, you know, this is aiming to indoctrinate our children. Like I think that's also misguided and misunderstood.
Hi, late edition. I'm Shannon. I'm with FIER as a hate crime researcher volunteer. I'm a master's student at Georgia State University studying public policy with an emphasis on health policy. And so a lot of my health research intersects with race and actually CRT and how it kind of integrates into our current healthcare system, specifically in minorities. And I would say that I think the pushback on CRT is really just a fear from the adults. They don't want to critically look and see that, hey, I benefit from a systemically racist society, and that there are people who are trying to break down the facade of like what we think our democracy is, and how there are people who are continuously systemically disenfranchised, and that they possibly, at the top, policymakers, are the ones who are contributing to it. And so it might be out of some malice that they don't care and they just want to hang on to their power. And it could be out of just, I don't know, naivety that they just don't really want to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. And the truth is that people of color have dealt with this forever, and it's uncomfortable for us. I remember when my youngest brother came back from school. I think it was like the senior year of high school, and he was like, "Oh, we have to talk about, you know, the Civil War again. Like, I need to know more, you know, slaves and all this stuff." And it's like, yeah, Black kids and people of color are subjected to kind of this awful history that we kind of share of oppression, But the minute we want to talk about it in nuance and with compassion, and it's met with pushback, and it can be really frustrating. So I think we need to ask, like, why is it people don't want to talk about it at all?
I think as I hear everything, what seems to be an overlapping theme between what everyone has said so far is that when it comes to critical race theory, there really is this general fear. There is fear mongering in general, and really to be able to get to be part of the issue and facilitate change, people have to be willing to engage in. I said to someone, a brave space the other day. Sit with the discomfort of whatever it is that you learn, and then also, like when you look at it on a political perspective, understand the power, the irony actually of, I guess, the power at play that people can use their access to facilitate whole changes in the education system because it makes them uncomfortable. Ironic to me, right? And then so when I'm looking at some of the comments that we got here, someone said that there's a trend with parents who are starting to homeschool their children because of critical race theory. Have you guys heard about that?
Yes.
And so I guess, what do you even do about that? I mean, once they leave the school system and the parents take it upon themselves to teach their children what they want to teach them, there's not very much that you can do at that point, right? So I guess, what do y'all think about that?
Okay, go ahead, Shannon. Go ahead.
You know, I don't know, competitive or whatever. I guess that would be a form of indoctrination, right? You're not critically attempting to talk about whatever it is that you're teaching, whether it's basic science or, you know, like reproductive rights and that stuff, to our nation's racial history or issues with race. So it's kind of funny that you would take your kid out of school because you fear that they're indoctrinated, but then you're just going to do the same thing at home. So it's like, it's not okay that the school does it and it opens their eyes to the realities of the world, but I can do it because I want to shield my child for whatever reason.
I think that this is a really good question. This is something that we have been looking at through the CRT Forward Tracking Project. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is when you look at these anti-CRT measures, whether they're legislative bills, resolutions, school board policies, or just statements in general, some of these anti-CRT measures allow for what they call parents' rights, which if you delve into it a little deeper, you'll automatically find that what it is curricular surveillance on 1,000, because parents can look at or look over a curriculum or see who's coming to speak in their student's class and decide that they want to pull the student out of the class, right? And so if they do not agree with what it is that might be discussed or what the curriculum is, et cetera. And there's a significant amount of anti-CRT measures across the country that have this sort of provision. So this is kind of like a light version of the homeschooling move that we're seeing. Another thing that we saw is that there are a few bills, right? My prediction for 2023 as it relates to anti-CRT measures, right? Today, we have about 568 different measures that have been introduced in 49 states. The only state where an anti-CRT measure has not been introduced is in Delaware, which is interesting. But what I think is going to happen is that a lot of these legislative bills are going to start incorporating vouchers, right? So if a parent doesn't like what's going to happen in the classroom, right, they don't want CRT to be discussed. And I think that's something else we should probably demystify really quickly, right? Because we're talking about CRT, but it's not the same sort of CRT that's being advanced through these bills and these bans, right? So if a parent doesn't want their child to learn CRT, then they could apply for public funds from the state in order to homeschool their children, right? And so
Interesting.
there are 3 different bills that were introduced in last year's legislatures that had this provision, and all 3 expired, right? They weren't put through the full cycle of the legislative approval. But what I think is that in the year 2023, that there will be a lot more of these specific anti-CRT vouchers that would be available to caretakers who want to remove their children from the classroom and teach them in the same ways or under the same like definition of indoctrination that we've been discussing here already. And so while I know there's a comment here about vouchers in some states, there are vouchers in some states, but the vouchers that I'm referring to specifically are directly related to not wanting your child to learn about these topics, about a full and true and intentional and accurate history of this country and how we've come here today.
Can I say just something real quick?
Go ahead.
Yes, I love these points, and it just made me think about a couple things that I think are worth bringing up just for the sake of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this you know, we have experienced a level of polarization in our country over the past maybe 10 years, in my opinion, that has progressively gotten worse over time.
Yep.
And so, when we hear about parents who are willing to take their kids out of school and literally homeschool their child, right? Like, he was a parent during the pandemic. You know what it was like to homeschool children. It's not like, and we recognize the importance of having teachers, right? Like, so it's a lot. It's a huge undertaking, right? So just recognize that. So if you are literally willing to do that so that your kids don't talk about race in school, that is saying something about how we are operating as a society, right? So, so let's put that out there. And so there's something there that I think needs to be addressed. I don't know how to do it, and to be honest, I think it's not as black or white as we'd like to think about it, but there's something operating in how we are divided as a nation that I'd love to figure out a way to like come closer together, even if we can't agree on I don't know, ideas, right? So how do we do that? I have no idea, but I do think there's something there that we need to do. I don't know exactly what it is. The other thing I want to bring up is I also think there may be some underlying attack on public education as an institution, right? So like we're talking about literally, it's not just CRT, it's everything else about public schools right now that are being attacked. It's the curriculum, it's the teachers that you're hiring, it's the type of things that schools are able to do or not able to do. And so, there's all kinds of things that I think are happening that also might point to an attack on public education as a whole. And so is CRT a part of that or is it not? I don't know. But I think we should also be examining how do we actually maintain and sustain our public schools throughout the United States. We are seeing, particularly in predominantly Black communities in large cities, public schools closing at a rate that we've never seen before. There are schools, just this past last year, there were like 13 public schools slated to close in Oakland, right? Schools that are serving predominantly Black students in Oakland. And so, there's a big question about, well, is there something happening where our public schools are being attacked? And is CRT just a way of, almost masking that underlying thing that's happening to our public education?
A means to an end, really, for a bigger plan.
Yeah, so there's that. The last thing I'll say is I've been thinking about this for a variety of different things, but it's very interesting to think about how a certain side of the political spectrum is doing a lot of the same things that maybe like the liberal or side of the political spectrum have been doing for like decades or centuries, right? Like the idea of pulling your kid out of school and homeschooling them because you want to make sure they get a good education. Like I know Black families who did that because of schools that they would send their students to where they would literally have their child suspended like throughout their entire year, or they would have experiences in education that were demeaning or weren't the best environment or space for their students to go to. And so, it's just interesting to think about this idea around like, you know, if we don't actually like the institutions that exist for us, and we actually want to do something about it, what are all the different avenues that are available to us? And now it's almost like how do we like reconcile the fact that a lot of the strategies that, you know, the liberal left or progressive folks have had over the course of the last few decades are sometimes now being like the same language, the ideas are almost the identical to how the political right is approaching some of these issues. Like, we're literally going to take our kids out of school because schools are harmful to our kids. And so we're going to try to teach them at home so they have values and et cetera at home. I don't know. So I just wanted to bring that up. I don't have an answer to anything, but they're just thoughts that came to my mind that I felt that, you know, would be helpful to the conversation.
I think it's interesting, actually, when you really look, again, I guess when you take a moment to look at history, the idea that there's this type of teaching that is being introduced to newer generations and there's a pushback against it is ironic, again, because when you look at the South, there was the whole concept of Southern revisionism and the concept of the Daughters of the Confederacy, how they had a whole campaign where they changed the wording of library books in elementary schools, and they had a committee that literally like scanned them. They approved the books, and if the book said a certain thing about the South or like how they lost the war, the book was not allowed in schools. They did this for generations, and there was no pushback. I don't know how many people were aware that this was happening, but it's within recent times that people are finding out this is the thing that was done back then, and it was fine. And it's actually, again, when we look at like the legacy that it's had, there are generations of people in the South who still to this day say, oh, the Civil War was about heritage, not hate, even though there are war documents that state that like slavery like 200 times. So it's interesting that, again, this concept of like history repeating itself, that things like this were done for another purpose and it slid by, but now it's coming back up again and there's this huge pushback, and you talk about it being part of a smaller part of like a larger plan. It's kind of scary to think about, and again, I keep seeing the irony in it. In a way, as I'm listening to how you guys answered, I feel like you kind of answered our second question here. The second question was like, how does the public's attitude towards CRT impact educators and students? Is there anything else that you maybe want to add to that?
I don't think so. I think one of the things that's been really interesting to me, so like I said, I'm from New York and I live in California. And so a lot of the anti-CRT media reports have been around this, like, oh, this is a red state issue. This is a conservative problem. This is something that we only have to worry about if we're in Texas, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. And that the data shows that that's not true. Like I mentioned before, there are 49 states in which anti-CRT measures have been introduced. In California alone, there have been 13 different anti-CRT measures that have been introduced and 9 that have been enacted. At this point, California local school boards that have introduced anti-CRT activity have a higher enactment rate than all of Florida, than all of South Carolina, than all of Missouri, right? When we look at it based on percentages. And I think that a large part of why that number is 9 and not 13 is because of the advocacy on the behalf of parents and students and teachers and advocates that understand the importance of telling a true and accurate history, of being anti-racist, of understanding where CRT is foundational to anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, all these things, and advocating that their students learn about this stuff. And so one of my favorite tenets of critical race theory comes from Kimberly Crenshaw's Race Reform and Retrenchment, right? Because, and what that article essentially says, and I hope nobody's in here that's going to be like, Taifha said it was this, and this is not how I understand it. What's really cool about CRT or academic disciplines is the idea that none of this is finished. None of this is done, right? And what's sad about what's happening is that students might not get the tools they need in order to help us finish this work, right? And so before I got off track a little bit, but essentially my favorite thing about Kimberly Crenshaw's Race Reform and Retrenchment is this idea that civil rights progress, while it's better now than it's ever been, is not traditionally on this upward trajectory, right? It's kind of like hills and valleys, essentially. And right now we find ourselves in a valley, right? But the aspirational thing, or the thing that continuously provides me with hope, is the fact that whenever you find yourself in this valley, there's always a peak of progress that's on the horizon, right? When you think about enslavement in this country, and that was definitely a valley that we were in, then you think about post-enslavement, you think about Brown, but then you think about Jim Crow and Juan Crow, but then you think about all of these other civil rights advancements that took place afterward, right? And so even though there are 568 different anti-CRT measures out there, the thing that really keeps me committed to this work and provides me with hope is the idea that there are people like you on this call who are committed to learning more about this stuff and sharing what you've learned, and also people who are willing to engage in the practice of CRT and being able to say, no, we're not going to introduce this anti-CRT measure. This is what not only my students need to learn, but your students as well, right? CRT isn't just for students who have been historically minoritized or subordinated. It is for everyone. It's like you said, Robbie, if we don't know our history, if we don't know our past, then we are doomed to repeat it. And that whole practice of, redlining different books and determining what's in the curriculum, that's what's happening now. That's what happened with the math textbooks that were banned in Florida, or that's what happened with, book bans of how to be an anti-racist, or Toni Morrison's work, or the Native American coloring, the Native American children's book, Fry Bread, right? There are measures that have taken place in our history where we've looked back and we said, I don't know about that. Like, we shouldn't, what was we thinking, right? That are happening now, that people are being engaged in now. And it's extremely important that we continue to have people who can advocate for a truer, more accurate, and intentional telling of history to ensure that students are provided with the tools that they need in order to help us fulfill and finally reach our potential as a truly multiracial democracy.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Say it again.
I don't think I can do that, but I'm interested in hearing what y'all got to say.
I want to emphasize this point that Taifha made about that it's for everybody, right? Like, this is not just like a thing for Black and brown students. This is for everybody. Like, imagine, like, in the example I bring up is, if you are a white student and you go to school and you look around and no one, like, I'm sorry, not no one, but everybody looks like you, right? Like, you go to school and you look around, everybody looks like you. Like, you must be thinking in your mind, I mean, they're probably comfortable, like, they're comfortable, right? Because everyone looks like you. But there's a question that should come up for kids on, why is that the case? Why do I go to school where everybody looks like me and everyone comes from a similar socioeconomic background, right? They could go to school, they can go through 4 years of high school, all years of middle, they can go through their whole K-12 experience and not ever have a space to have that dialogue around why, but still think it and feel it and understand that that's there, right? Because they recognize the world doesn't look like their school, but that's the school that they go to. And so when we think about talking about race, talking about our history and an accurate account of our history. It's not just for Black and brown students, it's for everybody, because we all experience it in varying different ways. And it's naive to think that our students don't see it or don't recognize that that's an issue, right? Because they do. And if you don't have that conversation in your classroom, they never will have that opportunity to really learn and engage and actually build the multiracial democracy that we're talking about right here. And so, I just want to emphasize that point, because I think often people think, oh, CRT is like a thing that we want to make sure happens for our Black and brown and low-income students and Indigenous students and Asian students. But I think it's something that we need to continually reiterate, that it's for everyone, right? Because it's not like our students live in some blind world where they don't see race. And they also recognize that even if they go to a school, right, that where everyone looks like them, the world doesn't look that way. And so I think it's just really, I just want to emphasize that point from what Taifha said, because I think it's important for us to understand.
Children, I think, are more sensible than we
Adults.
give them credit for. So yeah. So actually, while you guys were talking, very well said, very well answered, y'all. I actually said this earlier and I realized my mic was muted. Technology problems. So someone actually asked a question here, and they said, so what are your opinions of parents who take children out the classroom if they're not comfortable with a non-BIPOC teacher teaching critical race theory? I feel like, in my opinion, honestly, looking at this just from an outside perspective, if they are teaching the foundational information that is important, then why does it matter what color the teacher is? Now, I understand that bias does play a point. And I actually remember being in high school having a history teacher who talked about the civil rights, the Civil War, and said, oh, there was slavery, but it wasn't that bad. Not all the slaves were upset, and introduced books to us that were written that said that it was not so bad. And I remember hearing that as a high school kid, and I was like, that doesn't sound right. And as a high school, you understood that. So I understand how there would be bias that would influence the way the curriculum is taught. But at the end of the day, regardless of your race, if you teach on a subject as important as that, if anything, it is important that you get to have this from a variety of different people teaching about the subject, because again, it goes back to the idea, this is not just a thing for the BIPOC community, this is for everybody, you understand? And you don't know the psychological and social impact that it has for, say, a white student in the classroom to hear a white teacher talking about this, do you understand? So that's my thoughts. What are y'all thinking?
I think sometimes it's easier to receive information from people of your sometimes, because you can kind of connect on the same level. And so if a white teacher is teaching white students, not that they wouldn't value the opinion of a BIPOC, it just could be something that they can relate to a little more and take, I don't know, a little more seriously. I've been the lone Black kid in those classes with just white kids, just white teachers, and anything that comes up that's about race, you feel kind of shut down. And even if you BIPOC professor, there's this weird tension, like students don't really take them seriously, they don't really care, but it, like you guys said, for everybody, I think it would be really important for non-BIPOC teachers to come in and accurately, non-biased teaching of CRT.
I can see that. It's
I can try to answer this real quick too, just from the perspective of the teacher who did this in my classroom. And I taught over 90% of my students almost every single year that I taught for 6 years were Black. And so I'll talk to the teaching point in a minute, but the first thing I'll talk about is practicality, right? We have, at least from the last time I looked at the data, a teacher force in the United States that's over 70% white, right? So most of our teachers in the United States are white. And so there's a whole conversation about how do we actually bring more racial diversity to the teaching profession. And there's actually even dedicated efforts to bring more Black teachers to the profession, right? And so there's a whole conversation around, if we actually even want to have, BIPOC educators being in front of students, there's a practicality component there that I think a lot of people are trying to address, and it's also somewhat very difficult and will take some time to even get to the point where we can just be like, we have a teacher profession that represents all of our students that exist within our nation. So that's one point. The second thing is, in the meantime, it's like what I've learned over my educational career is teachers who spend the time really both learning that history in an accurate and like an accurate way that portrays an accurate account of our history can be really good at actually sharing that information with their students in an empowering type of way, right? So regardless of what type of background that teacher comes from, they have to be very how they approach teaching the concepts to their students and the ideas and essentially giving them that information in a way that the students can actually be critical about the information that they're giving them, right? So they have to be very well-trained teachers. There are tons of different programs that do a good job at training, great schools of education that do this. And so, that's one thing. That's on the training side. On the other side, that teacher has to have a really good relationship with parents, right? And the community that they serve. So if you are someone who lives in a predominantly Black community, and the teachers that teach at the school that your child goes to, if they're not deeply engaged within that community, if they're not deeply engaged with their students, and if they're not deeply engaged with you, then there's a trust issue that is historic, right? Historically, our communities don't trust white teachers because there are all kinds of harms that have been associated with having predominantly white teachers teaching Black and brown children. So I think like there's this relationship factor that we need to consider on how we actually engage with our students, particularly at a time when most of our teachers they just simply don't reflect our students. And so how do we kind of think through the practicality component and improve like racial diversity within our teacher profession, but also the teacher themselves, like what's the type of training that they're getting, and also what are the relationships that they have with their parents and their community that actually helps them feel like, at least the parents feel like they trust their teachers enough such that their teachers can actually teach the things that they want to teach them in the classroom. So I'll just stop there.
I think one thing that I'll add really quickly is that, so I went to law school at Georgetown, and then I got my advanced degree from UCLA. And I think in the spirit and essence and honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's important to note that it's going to be all of us or none of us, if that makes sense, right? It's going to take all of us to be able to rectify the racial injustices that have taken place in this country. And I think the things that everyone has already said amplifies that, right? You need to be informed. You need to be in community with the folks that you're serving. Some of the people who I have learned critical race theory from have been the Kimberly Crenshaws, the Cheryl Harrises, the Devin Carbatos of the world, but they've also been, right, the Gary Pellers, right, a straight white man who has been teaching CRT at Georgetown for over 30 years. It's been Noah Zatz who's been teaching CRT at UCLA for, I think he's at about 25 years now, right? So, and those people are also integral to understanding where we are and how we can transform racial power in American society. And so, again, it's going to take all of us or none of us.
Right. So as we prepare to wrap up, as we have about like 10 minutes or so, I guess another question that was asked here, and I do think that it kind of ties in with the final question that we did have for this discussion. The final question for the discussion was like, how can we as a society address racial disparities in our education system when we have this obstacle of like CRT being banned? And we've touched on the idea that we have to do it in community. It takes a communal effort of everybody from every walk of life engaging in this conversation. Likewise, though, something we have to consider is that parents, someone said parents are busy trying to put food on the table. So how can parents even be aware that like something like this is happening? And then like what steps can they take to make sure that the children is learning what they need to learn?
That's a good great question. I think it goes back to what I said, that it's going to take all of us, right? Being in community and understanding the communities that you're serving also means understanding that parents need to put food on the table, that advocates and activists also have to ensure that they are not pouring from an empty cup in order to make these changes possible, right? And so I think that one way that we are doing this at UCLA's CRT Forward Tracking Project is to provide the data, right? So our website is accessible at crtforward.org. And on that website, you'll be able to see all about the measures that I mentioned. You'll be able to see more about the team that's leading this initiative, as well as some blog posts that really help people understand some highlights from the most recent data uploads and things like that. So the most important thing, in my opinion, is being informed of what's going on in your backyard, what's going on in your state, what's going on in your neighboring state, what's going on in the country overall. So it really is important at first, right? In order to be an agitator, to be a co-conspirator, in order to be a collaborator, you have to be informed. You have to know what's going on. And we have made it easy for advocates, for parents, for activists, for policymakers, lawyers, litigators to be able to go onto this website. Oh, thank you so much for the link. To go onto this website and to really understand the full magnitude and the breadth and scope and pervasiveness of this anti-CRT disinformation campaign, so that you could say, oh, look, my local school board is considering this anti-CRT measure. Their next meeting is 3 weeks from now. If I can't go because I have to pick up our child from school or babysit or something like that, maybe I could have my friend attend. Maybe I can write an email instead, or maybe I can figure out another way to ensure that my voice is heard, so that we can really move progress forward as it relates to ensuring that our kids really know about the full history of this country, so that, like Robbie, I keep coming back to your quote, so that we're not, doomed to repeat it. And so that's something that's tangible that folks can do easily. And that shouldn't be too much of a time sink, because I think we make the information really accessible. And I see here that my friend Jo Isabel Jones is also suggesting African American churches could develop Saturday school to educate children, and that's something that's a really good point, and something that can be done as well.
Wow. So can you guys believe it has literally been an hour at this point? Wow. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into this and joining in this conversation about critical race theory. Hoang, thank you so much. Taifha, thank you so much for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
We did, and Shannon, thank you for joining. We did pin the link that Taifha mentioned to our chat. So as we're about to close down in like a minute or two, if you guys want to take a screenshot of that so that you can revisit it, I highly recommend it. And I hope you guys found this conversation good. And if you liked it, tune into our next one next month. Again, thank you guys so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I want to give a huge shout out to everybody that, just joined us. I feel like I just saw a lot of people, like, this is the first time I've actually ever done this, but so you like, when someone joins, you say, oh, so-and-so just joined. I'm like, that's somebody I know, that's somebody I know. So if I know you and you're on this, I'm sending you so much love for being here. I appreciate you. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
Same. Thank you, friends, for joining.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.